to my dissertation lecture recital. Most of you know me already. I think actually everyone in this room does, so we can spare introductions. What we're going to be talking about today is a software package for MaxMSP that I wrote for my dissertation. The title of this presentation is called PnP.Maxtools, which is the name of the software, a plug-and-play package for Max using real-time music information retrieval algorithms, or MIR. The format for today's lecture is going to be first the concept, so how the software is supposed to be used for music composition. Then the application, which is how the music information retrievals actually work, how they function, sort of like the under the hood stuff. And then finally a demonstration. So I wrote a series of compositions. We're going to listen to some excerpts of compositions which were not able to be performed live, and then we're going to hear two performed live from you here today. So first a little bit about the foundation for the package and sort of how it was written and what it was written for. So it was written for this visual programming environment called MaxMSP, which is a real-time environment specifically used for audio and video applications. It's a lot of, there are also a lot of real-time applications that people use this software for. The image on the right is a program window in Max. It's what we call a patch. And so rather than having lines of text, lines of code that you then execute, all of the functions, all of the code is arranged visually into these little boxes, which we can see 4 of here. And these are what are called objects. And so the PnP.Maxtools, all of the algorithms are what we call objects. And so inside of a blank patcher window, we can create an object. To create any of the algorithms from the PnP.Maxtools object, we use the prefix PnP dot and then the name of the object. And that loads in all of the stuff that the object does when something runs in through one of the inlets, which that information gets transformed in some way, and then we send it out of an outlet to do something else. So the PnP.Maxtools package was written in MaxMSP. It is a set of open source objects designed for the real-time automation of control parameters. It's developed around 4 modular categories. These categories are filters, descriptors, controls, and effects. And then most importantly, the largest category is a set of real-time music information retrieval algorithms. And so this category is the largest category out of the other 4 in the package, and it also represents the novel and sort of, I'm going to say proprietary, but there's not a patent or anything, but these are new introductions to the Max environment. So these categories are broken down as follows. You can see the descriptions there on the left. The image in the center is the package home patcher. So whenever you open MaxMSP and you want to learn more about some of the objects, you open the home patcher. And so we see the title, PnP.Maxtools, a plug-and-play package for Max. And then we see each of the 4 categories, and in each of the objects underneath the name of the category that describe what each object does. And so we can see the descriptors of the largest category. There is a framework that I propose, which is the way that the package is intended to be used. There are other ways that you can use it, but the framework sort of presents how these categories are supposed to work together. And so if we have an input signal, incoming signal from a microphone, let's say, like the 2 microphones, we have one on the cello and one on the singing bowls, we can take in this input signal, and if the signal's noisy or it's too loud or we want to change components of the sound, we can use filters. And so the filters provide pre-post processing functionality. So maybe our sound is really, really noisy. We want to remove some of the higher frequencies. We can do that with filters. Then we have the descriptors, which retrieve information about the component frequencies of the sound or about the spectral content. And they do so according to a variety of different measurements and algorithms. And so the names of the descriptors sort of describe what they are trying to retrieve from the signal. So like the first one, PnP amplitude, it measures the loudness of the sound. PnP boominess measures the boominess of the sound in a way that we'll talk about here a little bit later, and so on and so forth. The controls provide a variety of other functions. So the very first control is PnP auto scale, and so it takes in the signal, and you specify a target amplitude value, and then it automatically scales the signal up and down towards that, that target amplitude level. And one reason for this is that some of the descriptors are amplitude dependent, and so if the sound is very, very loud, regardless of its content, it's going to make the output from all of the descriptors spike. It's going to activate all of them, and so sometimes we want to auto scale the input. PnP smoother is used for if your data is very noisy, if it, let's say it jumps between 0 and 1 continuously, or if the sound is really quiet and it's hard to get an accurate measurement of the content of the sound, then the smoother object will sort of smooth out some of the changes and prevent your data from being useless, essentially. And then finally, the effects. These are an assortment of common audio effects. I can't take credit for making any of these. These have been around for quite a while, but I repurposed common uses of them for this package and then built them specifically to be able to be controlled from the output of the music information retrieval descriptors. So more about the concept. We can see what I'm calling a reflexive system here in the top right. Something really cool happens when we take a signal and we analyze some property of it, and then we use that data from our analysis to control the way we process the signal in real time. What's kind of cool about this is it creates what we call automation as like a reflex. And so the analogy that I make is to a reflexive system that is in a physical context, one in which we're all familiar with, which is called the patellar reflex test. And so in this analogy, the doctor hits your knee with the patellar, and you could think about that as like the incoming signal. Your sensory receptor retrieves some data about that signal that you've been hit, struck, let's say. And then that sensory receptor is mapped at the level of the spinal cord to your quadricep muscles, which is similar to the music information retrieval output being mapped as control data to the audio effect. And what's really interesting about this is when you get hit with the patellar, your knee jerks involuntarily and automatically. So your brain is not involved with this process at all. And in a similar way, the reflexive system in a digital context, the change in the quality of the sound coming into the system affects the way the sound is processed involuntarily and automatically. Excuse me. And so I call this a reflexive automation or a reflexive system. And so the idea behind this is that as composers and as electronic musicians, when you think about automation in this way, this sort of alleviates the performer of any unnecessary gear. Like they don't need controllers, they don't need knobs, they don't need foot pedals to control the electronics because they can do so simply with the sound of their own instrument in real time. And so I have a couple of bullet points here, and this is for me just like a starting place. These aren't, this isn't the law of the land, but I propose that for a system to exhibit reflexive automation or to be fully reflexive, it must possess the following characteristics: that the information must be retrieved externally from the source or from the system, preferably from live instruments, because that's a lot of my work is composing with live instruments, but ideally it could be with any external, could be externally retrieved in any way. The mapping from the music information retrieval output to the audio effects can be linear or nonlinear, so there's a whole lot of mapping techniques that you can utilize. You could have 10 different audio effects and you could have them all controlled in different ways. You could have 10 different music information retrieval algorithms that all process and change one audio effect. So there's a lot of different ways that you can combine these, and so this goes back to the idea of modular categories, having different categories that have specific functions, but then a lot of objects within those categories that are interchangeable. And then finally, automation must be dependent upon external information only. And so for a system to be fully reflexive, to be autonomous, automatic, and involuntary, once the system is set up, as the digital system is shown on the top, it should be able to run as is without any supervision from a governing body. So what you'll see tonight here in these two performances, you'll see just instruments and just microphones and no control over the way the electronics sound other than by the sounds of the instruments themselves. So before we get into talking about the specifics of a couple of the music information retrieval algorithms, I'll very briefly describe the sort of foundation for all of them and for a lot of music information retrieval broadly. So this is an algorithm that's called the fast Fourier transform. It's a type of discrete Fourier transform. It just means that it's used primarily on digital signals. And what the Fourier transform says is that any complex waveform can be expressed as the sum of harmonically related sinusoids, each with its own amplitude and phase. And so what this really means is that the way we're used to seeing signals, audio signals, as on the image on the right, is actually the left portion of the image, the little square above time. So we're used to seeing along the x-axis time plotted, and then along the y-axis amplitude. But what an FFT does is it takes this segment of audio, it's usually several milliseconds, somewhere from like 20 all the way up to 80 in some cases, it depends on the size. And it takes in a segment of audio, which we call a frame, and it converts this signal, which is in the time domain, to the frequency domain. And what this means is that this is the second portion, the little blue square with the three little spikes on it, is this means we take the signal on the left and we view it in terms of frequency along the x-axis and amplitude along the y-axis. So we're viewing an entire several milliseconds of time as a single frame, as a single image. And this is kind of why we use the term frame. Think of like an image, of a film, let's say. And so we could see from this image, the waveform on the left is composed of three individual sinusoid waves. And so when we do time to frequency domain conversion, we get three spikes in our frequency spectrum, which correspond to the strength of each of those independent frequencies. So the FFT is very useful because we can take any sound and we can look at the content of the sound spectrally. Does it have a lot of low frequencies? Does it have a lot of high frequencies? Etc. And then we can do other types of analysis to look through and actually measure it in different ways. You know, what's the proportion of high frequency energy to low frequency energy? Like how does the energy slope, maybe from the low end to the high end? Where's the center of mass, let's say? So we can do all types of analysis once we do time to frequency domain conversion. So when we start to look at the frequency spectrum of a signal, we talk in terms of features. And so features are just things that we describe about the signal. So like how bright it is, what, in some more complicated cases, what's the genre of the music, what's the tempo. We call these things that we can extract either objectively or subjectively features. And so another thing is that when we talk about features, we're talking about them either in terms of objectivity or subjectivity. And so features that are objective, we can quantify them in a very, very specific way. And features that are subjective, we can only describe. And so features that are subjective are typically the kinds of, we use the type of language that a non-musician might use to describe music. What's its mood? How does it make you feel? What's its energy? Things like that. That are much harder to objectively quantify, but still have some important meaning as it relates to the content of the sound at large. And so many of the PnP.Maxtools descriptors, they fall kind of in the middle of this category between objectivity and subjectivity. What this means is that the way we go about analyzing the features of the sounds that are the names of the objects, they're objective measurements, but the terms that those objects describe, or that the terms are supposed to evoke, are subjective descriptors. And so, in the next slide, we're going to look at three. First, brightness, depth, and warmth. And so these are types of subjective semantics. So what does bright mean? What does depth mean? These are terms that would vary with age, with culture, things like that. But we can describe them objectively. And then how much the objective measurement correlates to a subjective descriptor is sort of up for debate. We're getting in the realm of like psychoacoustics at this point. This is a big area in my dissertation research, but sort of outside of the scope of what we have time for today. Several of these descriptors have the same basic architecture. The very first thing we do is we use an FFT to convert from the time to the frequency domain. So we want to view the entire frequency spectrum. Then we perform a calculation on each frequency bin. And so within a frame, we have what are called bins. And you could think of bins as like vertical slices within a frame. And so if we only have 2 bins per frame, we can only represent 2 frequencies per frame, which isn't a lot. That just gives us very little information. We either have a low frequency and a high frequency. So you want a lot of bins when you're doing your measurements, because this gives you more potential data that you can extract in terms of usable value out of your frame. So we perform a calculation on each bin within a frame, and then we sum the products of this calculation for each bin within the frame, and then each object outputs a single floating point value between 0 and 1. And it does this once per frame. So we time frequency domain conversion, we do our calculation, it gives us a number, we go on to the next frame. And all of the objects output a number between 0 and 1, where 0 stands for not representing or having any of that type of quality, and 1 meaning it has a lot of that type of quality. And so if I were running a sound through the brightness music information retrieval algorithm, and I got an output of a 1, that means the sound would equate very, very closely or correlate with perceived levels of brightness. If it's 0, it means it's not very bright at all. The same thing with depth, which prioritizes low frequencies over high frequencies, and then warmth. And so we can see that the sort of description of what each of these models is supposed to describe. So bright sounds analyze high frequency energy, and we can see that all of these have a similar structure. And so the equation on the left-hand side, the upper spectral centroid, lower, and then mean worth region, are essentially, it's the same formula. It's what we call spectral centroid analysis. It's the average weighted frequency per frame. So you can think about it as like the center of mass per each frame, where the average energy is concentrated within a frame. And this is very similar to how we calculate the mean. We add up all of the bins. And in the case of brightness, we add up all of the bins between 3,000 hertz and the Nyquist frequency, which is just half of the sampling rate. It's 22,050 hertz, so it's just outside of our upper threshold of human hearing. And we multiply each bin by the frequency of bin in, so the frequency associated with that bin at that place within the frame, and then the normalized magnitude. And then we divide that by the sum of all of the normalized magnitudes for all bins. So we're checking specifically for high frequency, for where the center of mass is in the high frequency range of the frequency spectrum. Depth does a similar thing, except we calculate the lower spectral centroid. So it's the same equation, but it's between the frequency range of 30 hertz to 200 hertz, so it's much lower. And then warmth. One of the ways that we calculate warmth, and one of the ways that it's suggested that the sensation of warmth is felt in a listener, is to have a very concentrated band of energy, as opposed to the energy of the frequencies being very distributed from the low to the high end. And so with warmth, we're looking for 2 things. We do fundamental frequency analysis on the signal. So we look for what the fundamental frequency of the signal is. If it's a flute, it's whatever the lowest note the flute is playing at that given time is. And then we take that fundamental frequency and we times it by 3.5. And this gives us a range of frequencies that we call the mean warmth region. And so this is the area that we calculate the spectral centroid within. And again, it's the same thing. We multiply each bin by the frequency of bin n and then the normalized magnitude. And then the warmth is going to change. If, let's say, a flute's playing a different note every second, the fundamental frequency is going to change with every note change. And so we're going to get a different measurement out of the warmth descriptor every second or so. And then the other thing we do is we calculate a ratio. And so after we find the center of mass in that band-limited range, we also want to know how much of the total energy is concentrated within that area as opposed to distributed. And so even if we have a really, really high spectral centroid within the range from 3 hertz to the Nyquist frequency, but most of the energy is like around 200 hertz, then it's not actually going to sound bright because most of the energy is not within that range. So we want to check the ratio. And so we do this by summing all of the normalized magnitudes of all of the bins from that range, and then dividing that by the range of all frequencies. And so if all of the frequencies are within the range of 3,000 hertz to the Nyquist frequency, then our ratio outputs a number of 1. And so we know that this is a good sign that the sound correlates highly with subjective levels of brightness. So one thing I want to do, just to sort of demonstrate the way these three work and how it's a fun listening opportunity. So I'll play a short audio sample, and we're going to hear 4 different sounds. The very first one, and we can see they're labeled, and the table might be too high, I don't know if you can see them. But the first thing we're going to hear is we're going to hear unfiltered white noise. So we're going to hear equal energy at all frequencies, equally distributed white noise. Then the second sound we're going to hear is we're going to hear the same white noise, but filtered within the range of 3,000 hertz to 22.5 kilohertz, so within the range in which brightness is measuring, and then within the range from 30 to 200 hertz, which is the range that depth is measuring, and then within the range of 150 to 500 hertz, which is approximately the range of the mean warmth region if our fundamental frequency is 150. And so we can get a sense of overall white noise, completely equally distributed sound, and then a sound that is, by the models, suggested to correlate highly with perceived levels of brightness, depth, and then warmth in that order. There are a couple of other descriptors we're going to touch on. There are 20 in total in the package, and we looked at 3 of them just briefly. We would be here all night if we looked at all 20. And we're going to sort of bullet point these because I don't think it's necessary to sort of go all in on how they work, but it's kind of interesting just to think about other ways in which we can look at all of the bins within a frame and the frequency spectrum, and different ways we can measure it. And so for all of these, we also do an initial fast Fourier transform analysis on the signal. But then from there, the roughness model, what we want to detect peaks within the spectrum. And so we do 3 things. We check whether each bin, and we start from the far left on the image at the top. We start at the very first bin, and we check to see if the loudness of this bin, or the energy at that bin, is greater than 0.1. And if it's not, we say this is definitely not something we want to consider a peak because it's not loud enough to be considered as such. In the cases where we do find a peak, so we have 2 here, and we have a couple that are even above 0.2, but in order to determine that this is a peak, we want to check the bins on either side and make sure it's actually that the bins on either side of the peak that we're looking at are softer than the current peak. And then the final thing we do is we check the frequency range between two peaks, and we want to make sure that the entire frequency range is actually is lesser than the lower peak. And so if we have a peak, let's say the one on the left and the two bends on either side are very close in amplitude to the current bend, and then the range in between that peak and the following peak are very close together, then it's very hard to hear this, just in terms of how we hear sounds as an actual peak, as a frequency that stands out amongst the spectrum. For the metallic model, this one estimates the probability of the sound being produced by a metallic object. And so for this one, we're just calculating probability, where P is our probability, and Y is the regression calculated using three specific different metrics. And so it's suggested by a lot of researchers that these three metrics correlate highly to metallic sounds, which are rich and have complex overtones. So for the normalized decay, we're looking at the envelope of the sound, the resonance of the metallic object, and how the overtones are how they sustain independently of one another and decay independently of one another. We're looking at the spectral spread as well, which is it's like the variance from statistics. So one way to think about this is just how much of the energy is evenly distributed across the frequency spectrum as opposed to concentrated around the center of mass. And then the roughness as described above. And so for each of these, we multiply them by some factor to scale the output from that analysis into some usable way to get them all within a similar range. Maybe the normalized decay is more important, and so that's where we're multiplying it by 4. We're multiplying another one by 0.005 because maybe it's less important. And then we just add them all up, and this gives us our probability after we solve for P. For boominess and sharpness, you can kind of think of these as like opposites. Boominess detects the proportion of low frequencies as opposed to high frequencies, and sharpness does the opposite. So for these two, we also do time to frequency domain conversion, and we add up all of the bends within a frame, and then we multiply by a weighting curve. And so for the boominess model, the weighting curve is at 4.5 for the first bend, and so we're really we're wanting to retrieve information from lower bends more specifically as opposed to higher bends. So we multiply by a weighting curve, which starts at 4.5, and it ends up at 0 near around 13,000 hertz or so. And then for sharpness, the curve starts off a little bit, it starts off flat, but then it curves towards the end of the spectrum around 8,000 hertz or so. And so in this case, we're checking the proportion of high frequencies to low frequencies. Boominess and sharpness are used a lot in the automobile and appliance industry. So the algorithm that boominess comes from is not real time until now, but the researchers who developed it used it to quantify the boominess of car engines, which is kind of interesting. Sharpness is used for appliances like vacuum cleaners, fans, that sort of thing, which have high frequency at high energies. So there are a couple of other applications, and we're sort of working our way towards the demonstration at this point. When we are using our music information retrieval models, there are a bunch of different ways we can go about attaching these to effects and controlling effects parameters. One thing we can do is detect events. And so in some cases, we might not want to just map the output directly to an audio effect. We might want to detect a singular event. So if I have an instrument and it's playing key clicks on its instrument, I might want to detect that as a moment in which I want a bunch of the electronic sounds change, as opposed to just having them continuously mapped. And so we call this event detection, looking at singular moments. And so in this example, we have sound coming in from a microphone, which is the black box with the microphone on it. And we have the signal going into two effects, two flangers. And then we have the signal also going into a roughness model. And so the left flanger, the output from the roughness model, is just going straight into 2 of the inlets. And so as the roughness of our incoming sound changes per frame, that value is going to be sent into our flanger, and it's going to change the way we're affecting the incoming signal with the flanger. In the second one, we're just setting a threshold of 0.75. And so what this means is that the second flanger will not sound any different until the roughness of the incoming signal exceeds 0.75, at which case it sends out a 1 from this object. And we apply this 1 to those inlets and what they control, and since the output of the descriptors is supposed to work with the input from or for the effects, we're going to hear a drastic change, an instant drastic change from a 0 to 1 in terms of how this flanger is operating on the signal. Something else that I think is useful to do is to also multiply the output of the signal before we send it out to our speakers by the amplitude of the signal coming in. So some effects just have a tendency to output a bunch of noise, and then, or a bunch of sounds rather, just because that's how they operate. And so in some cases you actually only want to hear the sound being affected when you're actually playing. And so in this case you might want to multiply the signal by the amplitude, and so when nothing is coming into the microphone, assuming it's not a noisy room, the amplitude is going to be 0, and so we're not going to hear anything until something's coming into our microphone. And so we can add a bunch of different effects and descriptors along the chain before we actually get to our output to create all sorts of meaningful interactions. Another thing that's really useful, and this is something that I stumbled upon as I was working on some of these models, is that sometimes roughness isn't a good indication of the overall change of a sound. Sometimes you need to express a change to a sound as changes to multiple descriptors all at the same time. So the difference between a cello and a violin, let's say, in terms of sound quality, might have more to do with actual spectral content than rather just pitch and register. And so it might be hard to get meaningful measurements using one particular descriptor. In some cases you might need multiple descriptors, and so I call these compound descriptors. And so an easy way to make any compound descriptor is just to take any descriptor from the package, multiply it by some factor, and make sure that the factor you multiply all of the models by ultimately adds up to 1, and then you sum them together. And so the compound descriptor in this case, the features we're looking for excuse me, is a combination of both the roughness and the depth of the signal as described earlier. So using this we can detect changes to all sorts of different parameters, sort of multidimensionally, which is kind of interesting. So we're about to listen to 2 excerpts of pieces that I wrote. I wrote 4 pieces total for my dissertation demonstrating these objects and the PnP.Maxtools package. First, there are a couple of other applications and affordances that I think pedagogically are useful, things I haven't really explored, but I think can be very, very appealing to musicians and composers interested in exploring electronic music. The first is in terms of accessibility. So, like I said, is often the case that you give your performer, not only your max patch, your program, but they also have other controllers. They have things they have to connect to their computer, foot pedals. They need all of this extra gear to make your music happen. And so one thing in terms of accessibility with this package and this way of thinking about reflexive electronics is that you don't need any gear. You don't need any additional controllers. All you simply need is a computer, which is running the max patch, and an audio interface, which is taking the sound from the microphone and putting it into the computer and then out. So in terms of accessibility, it offers a lot in terms that it's very easy, it's very portable, it's very easy to give. I haven't tried this, but I would love to give it to like middle school students who don't know anything about electronics, they maybe haven't tried it before, and just say, play. and see what they happen, see what kind of things they can discover on their own instruments. And then the other thing, for those of you who are musicians, you might notice that these scores have no indication that they have electronic elements. And so the other thing that I like about this is it offers a lot in terms of simplicity of notation. So I don't have to tell the performers what they're expected to hear. All I have to tell them is what they have to do to control the sound. And I can simply type it up as a page at the beginning of the score, give it to them, and then they read it and they go, okay, my loudness, if I play louder it does this, if I play softer it does this. And so they can think about the music in terms that they understand, and the scores can stay relatively uncomplicated and clean. So each of these compositions, we're going to start with the one at the top, concentric circles. This is one for piano trio, so it's for piano, cello, and then a percussionist playing vibraphone and crotales. In this piece, I'm using a bunch of music information retrieval algorithms. The interesting thing about this piece, though, is it's the only ensemble piece that I wrote demonstrating these models. And so one of the ways that this works, as opposed to the other pieces, is that some of the models that are analyzing features of each instrument are being summed together. And so whenever I play you this excerpt, you'll hear some moments where one instrument is really loud and the other two are soft. And you won't hear much in terms of audio effects because they're being summed together. And so when all of the instruments are playing at their loudest and the features are being detected at their maximum, depending on what they are, then we'll hear a lot of processing. And so it's kind of interesting thinking about this ensemble as like a collective electronic unit that can actually determine the electronics not only individually but together as a unit. With I/O, and I'll explain this one and then we'll just go straight down playing the excerpts. I/O is a piece for snare drum and electronics. And with this piece we are doing one very specific event detection function, which is we're trying to detect, or the patch is trying to detect, when the snares on the drum, which are like the metal snares, are off as opposed to on. So when the snare drum is on, we get a very sort of noisy, we get a lot of energy and high frequencies. When the snares are off, we hear only the tone of the drum and the pitch of the drum. It's very resonant. And so the electronics are trying to detect when the snares are off as opposed to on, and then they change the way that they process the sound accordingly. And you'll hear a bunch of other stuff, and I hope you'll have questions, because you'll hear more things that I'm not explaining. And so here is concentric circles. And here is I/O for snare drum, just an excerpt from I/O for snare drum and reflexive electronics. So finally, I'll be performing this first piece called Sing. It is for 3 singing bowls, and then my friend Edward Turugaloff will be performing Bloom, a piece that he commissioned a little over a year ago now. I'll leave this on the screen. I'll leave you to have any questions afterwards, and so I won't spend much time explaining the pieces. I'll leave you just to listen. So here is Sing for singing bowls and electronics. Thank you so much. I'll invite Edward up, and he will play the final composition. for you tonight. You can take questions at this time. And then go eat. Yes?
Are there any plans to build this out to where you can function with like the normal Max objects, like for the effects, or is it just the PnP then?
Do you mean like, do they work alongside other effects?
No, can you control like do the controllers only control the PnP effects, or can you control other non-PnP effects?
So you can control anything. So
Okay.
the output from the descriptors is just a number between 0 and 1.
Okay.
So you could use that to do literally anything you would with a normal floating point number in Max. Yeah, and same thing with the effects too. You don't necessarily have to use them with descriptors. You could just add reverb into some standalone piece and control numbers in another way. Yeah. Yes?
So I really enjoyed that you showed us something that was improvised and something that was notated. I thought that was a really nice contrast. So I'm just wondering if, when you're using these tools to compose, whether you think it has like influenced your approach to the music that you're making, and maybe like in what ways?
It definitely does. So when you're talking about like continuous controls over effects, and with the cello, this is kind of a great example, because the patch is set up to function with one particular, like in one way. And in fact, one thing that you definitely heard and picked up on was that all of the low notes of the cello were super reverberant and really delayed, and all of the high notes weren't. And so this is one, it's not a problem, but it's more of a constraint in that the way the piece develops around the electronics has to come from the score and the way you actually notate things. And so I definitely think about trajectory a lot more. And so with Bloom, it starts off very, very high notes and it works its way down, and the electronics become more and more aggressive as the piece goes on. And so I do think about that. And the other two pieces I demonstrated, there's an element of trajectory, working within those constraints in whatever ways that you think you might be able to get around. Yes?
So great pieces, really great work. Along the lines of Freya's question and on trajectory, for any of the pieces that you've played, are you controlling that trajectory artificially through some kind of either event counting or timeline or some time parameter, or is it entirely being driven by the instruments themselves in kind of a coherent way? And then follow up, if you're not, would you?
So yes, they are being controlled solely by the instruments themselves. That being said, you do have to not make sacrifices, but if you have an idea for something, and the way I usually approach this is I think about like what the instrument is capable of, like what are its notable features in terms of things that can be easily detected and described in a variety of ways with these algorithms, but you always run into problems, and so you have to sort of adjust course. So for the singing bowl piece, so they are all being controlled by the instruments themselves, but one of the things with the singing bowl piece I was trying to detect were the different strengths of the overtones. And so if the higher overtones were louder, then it would trigger some sort of effect. And I found that to be actually very difficult to detect, because if you're playing and you're improvising and you're thinking about gesture and where you're at in the piece, you're just going to trigger stuff all over the place to occur. And so one of the things I did is I actually got a wooden striker as opposed to ones with felt, and I used that, and it was much more tingy. And so they are being controlled, but you do have to, you'll run into problems sometimes getting useful measurements from sounds, because they're just really complex in some instances and very hard to detect with any degree of reliable accuracy, I guess. And there are still some things with this piece with the singing bowl piece in particular that because it's trying to make very fine, take very fine measurements, I'll trigger something accidentally sometimes, and then I just have to go with it as a performer. And so that's one reason why this piece is improvised as opposed to some of the others, is because it lends itself well to being improvised and sort of going with the flow. If you had different singing bowls, they would have different harmonics, different strengths of harmonics, and so you'd have the same problem, probably even worse, if you gave it to other performers in different states and you weren't able to send them the instruments you were using. So yes. Yeah.
So I have a question for both of you actually. So with a notative piece, or notative score, does it ever happen like when you play something wrong triggers, like something goes wrong with the patch, so you're like, as a performer, uh-oh, I did something wrong, or, you know, because like the performers are generally memorize the sounds as well while playing, they know how it's going to go, and if something goes wrong, it might affect their performance. Does that ever happen?
So this is a good question. I'll let Edward answer. Maybe he feels differently. I'm going to say no. Things never go wrong. But, so this image on the left is the actual, it's not the patch for Bloom, but it's the patch for the singing bowl piece. And so it's much more complicated than the other programs we looked at. And in part because of your question, you have to sort of, anytime you're working with any sort of like continuous controls, the number between 0 and 1, like on a flanger, like it's going to sound like not processed at all as opposed to fully like processed and very heavy. And you don't necessarily want that range, that wide range in terms of effects. And so you have to sort of, with every effect you add, with every output from a descriptor, you have to then decide, okay, what's the range of acceptability in terms of output. And so a lot of the objects there are just like clipping, scaling objects, things to move things into an appropriate range to minimize the possibility of things giving you a value that's just out of the realm of what should happen throughout the course of the piece. That being said, I did mention that sometimes things with the singing bowl piece, some of the modes, the things that it's looking for and detecting, sometimes get triggered accidentally. But even within each of those modes, there is this sort of process that's sort of keeping things in check. And so even if I accidentally trigger another mode, I know what's going to happen from then on out until I untrigger or go to a new mode. Like I sort of don't expect anything out of the realm of possibility because I've sort of designed it with like guardrails in a sense. Edward might feel a little differently.
No, actually not. I think, well, every time I play it sounds different, but overall I don't treat it as something went wrong. It's just, you know, different performance. I treat this patch as an extension of my own instrument. It's, you know, adds the sounds, adds the effects, it creates the nice, even deeper lower register on the cello, which is already deep. And, you know, and I'm trying to explore the combination of the effects that are being applied through the patch in order to make that piece flourish more.
And I didn't pay him to say that. Yes.
Just restating Dr. Beck's second half of his question, would you consider a timeline or a foot controller to trigger a change in the direction of the input?
Yeah, you certainly could. And there would be nothing wrong with that. The way that I was thinking about conceptually the way the package would be used was in terms of reflexive automation, which is supposed to stand on its own. But you can, it exists within Max. It's open source. You can download it and you can plug any MIDI controller in. You could network from computer to computer and process things. So you don't have to use this. Like, it's not like my way or the highway. The objects exist, and ideally people just make interesting music with them. And so that's why I tried to make a distinction between this idea of reflexive automation and then the real-time music information retrieval algorithms. They're kind of separate things. They can be used together in one specific way that I'm laying out, but yeah, I mean, ideally you can use them however. Yes, again.
I have a question for Edward. So Austin said he provided you with a score that described what would occur when you do certain things with your instrument. Did you find that to work out the way he suggested? And tell us about how you might have played around on your own with the.
Well, to be honest, I never looked at that part of the score. But I was listening and experimenting how the sound works, because I mean you can read a bunch of times, but it's about, especially when you're talking about music, you know, it might say something, but you don't know what it is until you actually hear it. So, and we've been working on that piece together, so we were experimenting together. So I didn't need to look at that part of the score. So I'm not sure, it probably would be helpful for someone who never had any experience, or just, you know, as a guideline, okay, what should the performer expect to happen? But again, once you start playing, there's no need in that instruction. So I find this patch, because I commissioned, was also part of my dissertation project, I commissioned 4 different pieces for cello electronics, and this was one was the easiest one to deal with, to perform with, because everything else was including some synth switch changes. I had to use 2 pedals. One of them included the loop pedal, which I requested myself, and then I regretted because of it. So, I mean, it's just more challenging to work with. This was by far the easiest piece to put together. So, thank you, Austin.
Yeah,
I have one more
great.
question.
Go.
It's kind of more of a comment. You described triggering the process using the quality of the instrument sound, and I'm stuck on the word "the quality of the sound," but I know you mean more like the frequency or the harmonic content, which could be different. Yeah, that's all.
Yeah, so some of those words they're used interchangeably, although they do mean different things. I guess what we are talking about are features, discernible features that can be objectively described. And then the other thing we're talking about is how close that objective measurement matches our perception of what we think when we see the word that the object is used for. And so a lot of great research was done by other people to determine the names, like the word roughness. I didn't really come up with that. So a lot of these subjective descriptors were, there was a lot of research done by very smart people that figured all of that out. And so I'm sort of building upon their language in order to use and build my project. That being said, I also built mine, and the next question after I built it is like, do people actually think that a rough sound, according to my model, sounds rough to them? And so another large component was actually doing a subjective listening study, which handful of people in this room were a part of. We listened to a series of audio files, and then we ranked the sounds according to how much they appeared to be bright or deep. And so that analysis is actually in my document. That'll be published whenever that comes out. But there was, as you would expect, some high level of correlation and then some outliers. These things aren't perfect. And this is still a large area of research, and so do with that what you will. But yes, we're talking about features more specifically, yeah.
I wonder how different it's going to sound using different cellos too. Because you were talking about different singing bowls and instruments like that, but even different acoustic instruments have different qualities.
Yeah, that's always a challenge. Yeah. Any more questions? Okay, thank you all so much for coming.